Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and what I would like to do with you in this video is talk about Michigan's natural resources. In particular, what we want to be able to do is to identify patterns, trends, and any kind of associations or correlations for Michigan's natural resources. And so there's a couple of materials that you have. One of them is this map. So this map is actually rather old. It was produced in the 30s. And this is a map of Michigan, and there's a legend here that shows where all the resources for Michigan are located. It's not quite exhaustive. There are other resources that are not actually included on this map that Michigan produces. This is all non-living, so there's nothing in here. There's no resources that are, so for instance, trees and wildlife. Those are resources, but those are not included in this map. This is all sort of mineral resources. And another resource that you have is this. This is a worksheet that's available on our class website that talks about which resources we're interested in, and there's a data table that we can use in order to sort of compile our data. So these are the things that we should be looking at: is this worksheet with this data table and also this map. And so what we want to be able to do is to figure out what kinds of patterns, trends, and associations can we find for different Michigan natural resources using this map. So how do we do this? Well, to start, what we should probably do is use some colors. There's honestly nothing better than colors in order to figure out where certain things are on a map. The human mind responds to colors. And so the first thing that we should probably do is to, for these resources, is to try to color them. Here's our key over here, so we can actually color them in the key, and to figure out where they show up on the map. We can use these colors to start coming up with these trends, patterns, and associations of these different minerals. So let's start with kind of a simple one. Gravel. So gravel, what the heck is gravel? Well, it's some kind of a sediment. It's a sediment that includes a lot of cobbles and rocks and stones, and it might also include some sort of more crumbly stuff like sand and maybe some other sort of resources here. But if we went ahead and colored gravel a certain color, here in this video I'm choosing green, we can see that it actually forms these kind of blobs. There's these blobs of gravel that show up all over the lower peninsula. And there's a ridge right here, sort of maybe 3/4 up the lower peninsula. And there's a few scattered areas in the UP. But we see that there's gravel all over the place, and it kind of forms these ridges, these amoeboid blobs all over the place. There's lots of gravel. And this is one of the resources that we might really be able to come up with a lot of questions about. How did this gravel get here? What do we even mean by gravel? Like, how's that different from, dirt or sand, or, what are we talking about when we say gravel? So if you went ahead and kind of connected the dots here, you'll find these different blobs of gravel. This is sort of interesting. So this is just one resource. Let's kind of move forward and start looking at some others. Sand. You might not really think of sand as a resource, but we find a lot of really high quality sand in Michigan, and most of it that we find is on the western coast, so sort of on the Lake Michigan coast, and then sort of around here near the bay. What we find is there's some really high quality sand resources here. And so one question that might come to mind is, why do we find sand here, but we don't really find it on the other coasts over here? We don't really find it in the UP that much. We don't find it along Lake Superior. There's all kinds of areas where it seems like we ought to find really high quality sand, but apparently we're not mining it. So here is where we find some really high quality sand along Lake Michigan. Why would that be? Lime and limestone are really interesting. We're going to do these together. Lime is just one of the ingredients of limestone. It's calcium carbonate. And if we went ahead and treated them as though they were the same thing, they're not quite the same thing, but we're going to treat them like they're the same thing. What we find is that they form this target shape. So we find this arch that's kind of northern pointing arch up here, and we find a southern pointing arch down here. There's kind of this line of lime and limestone, and then there's a blob around the bay here in the thumb area. And so we find this very, very clear pattern here, lime and limestone, in the northern, southern, and sort of in the bay. A very clear sort of target shape. That's sort of interesting. If we move forward and we look at dolomite, dolomite is actually a close relative of lime and limestone. But we notice it's located in different areas. It's farther north, right? So limestone was actually here along the northern tip of the southern peninsula, the lower peninsula. But up here, it's actually farther north. We find it on the southern coast of the UP, and then we also find it farther south over here, actually south of Detroit. So one question that might come to mind is, what the heck is dolomite? We're not talking about the Eddie Murphy movie here. This is actually something different. This is a rock. So what's going on with dolomite? It's kind of seems to be related to lime and limestone. It's just farther north and farther south. Let's talk about some igneous rocks. So if we go up to the UP, way up here in the Keweenaw Peninsula and sort of in this western half of the UP, we find a lot of basalt and granite. These are igneous rocks. These are formed from magma and lava that have cooled off over time. We don't find any of that in the lower peninsula, only up here. And so whatever process has resulted in these rocks are way different than the ones that resulted in these rocks down here. So, and what's also worth noting is that this is also where we find the metallic minerals such as copper and iron. That's where we find these really interesting resources, the big money, the resources that really bring in a lot of money, copper and iron. That's where we find them, is where these igneous rocks are located. That's kind of interesting. Marl. What the heck is marl? So we find a whole bunch of it in the southwest corner of the state. This is something that we can research a little bit more in the future. What is this? I'll tell you, it's a sedimentary rock, and we find it over here. What the heck is this? So it's actually really important to soil, so we can kind of do a little bit of research on that and figure out what is marl, what good is it for. Gypsum. Gypsum is designated by kind of an odd symbol here. It's a circle with a little cross through it. It's really hard to identify on this map. The resolution isn't perfect. But we find that there's a blob just north of the bay here, and then there's a little blob over here near the Grand Rapids area. And so we find there's some gypsum here. Contemporary gypsum, there's also some more gypsum that's actually mined in the Detroit area. That's not indicated on this map, but there is, since the 30s when this map was created, there have been new gypsum deposits that were discovered. So why is gypsum only located in a handful of areas, like really concentrated? That's kind of interesting. And last, and honestly probably least, is clay and shale. So clay and shale are produced by very, very fine sediments. We might remember that clay and shale are produced out sort of in deep water. So deep water is where you're going to end up with very fine sediments being deposited, as opposed to gravel. Gravel has to be moved by fast, rapidly moving water, or maybe some other sort of force, but clay and shale is produced by slow moving water out deep in the water. So we have a handful of just kind of random deposits of clay and shale in the state of Michigan, at least as far as commercially we have some clay and shale operations going on. These are sort of all over. I guess we could sort of generalize and say that they're sort of inside of the limestone and dolomite. So you notice that we've got dolomite, and then we have limestone, and then inside of that we have shale. So it seems to be kind of forming almost like layers. Like we see these kind of layers that we're noticing here. These are also located in the same area as the lime that we pointed out in the Bay Area. So clay and shale is kind of the least patterned resource that we find. Now, if we went ahead and superimpose these all on the same map, we get this. It's kind of, it might be a little bit intimidating at first, but all that we've really done is we've just looked at all these different resources, and we've just kind of sort of lumped them all on the same map. And this kind of helps us to really get a sense of perspective as far as what are the associations that we see between all of these different minerals and resources. There's lots of different things that we could come up with. This particular resource worksheet that I have for you here is going to help you to kind of compile your thoughts all onto the same document. But I hope that me, kind of identifying where these resources are and pointing out a couple of, interesting observations that we make, I hope that this was helpful in helping you to be able to identify patterns, trends, and associations for some of our resources. Michigan is very, very resource rich, and it's really just a matter of, where are the resources? Maybe where did they come from? What does this tell us about Michigan's geological history? So that's what's interesting here as far as looking at these resources. So I hope that this video is helpful in being able to help you to identify patterns, trends, and associations for several of the resources that we find in the great state of Michigan.